Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today or tonight, and welcome and thanks for viewing this recording. As we start the webinar in our various locations, I'd like to acknowledge that our broadcasting is from Dharawal country, and we pay our respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, past, present and emerging, as the traditional owners of this land. I'm Kate Rickersey, the Managing Director of Land Equity International, most commonly referred to as LEI. I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Tony Burns, Executive Director and Founding Director of Land Equity International. LEI emerged from an engineering school of thought, led by licensed surveyors and land registrars. Over the past 21 years, working across more than 35 countries, the LEI team and our large host of independent consultants have worked on over 125 land projects to respectfully deliver solutions that aim to ultimately improve the lives of the poor through good land governance. To all our consultants, partners, we are truly appreciative of your support and your endurance with us over the past 21 years. We're proud of our years of business success, the dedication and results that we have achieved, and the contribution to global knowledge within the land administration sector. Today, we'd like to share more recent reflections on land reform to continue to contribute and evolve the land agenda for sustainable development results. Tony Burns will lead the discussion today with a keynote presentation on the basis of his PhD with the University of Melbourne, questioning if there is a better way to undertake land administration reform. Tony will present the importance of an appropriate consideration of the political economy of property rights in the design of land reform. Before Tony starts, it's an honour to moderate this session with esteemed colleagues Jolene Sanjak, Victoria Stanley and Emmanuel Nkurunzi. Jolene is a Sector Director of Land Tenure and Property Rights at Tetra Tech. Jolene's a passionate and engaged professional in the land tenure, governance and gender equality space, with no less than 35 years experience watching various program trends evolve. Victoria, similarly wise and experienced, working in over 25 countries from Latin America, travelling east across to Central Asia. Victoria is a senior land specialist at the World Bank. And Emmanuel, it's a pleasure having you join us also, noting your appointments in the Rwanda public sector as the Director General of Rwanda Natural Resources Authority and Chief Registrar of Land Titles, and Director General now at RCMRD, the Regional Centre for Mapping for Resources for Development in Nairobi. Your practical experience is coupled with research at the University of Birmingham, and we look forward to all your contributions. A warm welcome and thank you for joining us everyone online. We have the chat and Q&A functions open for our audience today, as well as Tika Han, an audience member today, who will be producing a visual representation of the webinar discussion. Starting with a blank canvas as you see here, Tika will follow the conversations and prepare the illustration as the recording of the event, which we will share with you following our webinar. So without further introduction, I would like to thank you, Tony.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kate, for the introduction and for the opportunity in making this presentation and participating in this forum. I've been very fortunate to have had a long history in working in the assessment and design of land administration projects globally and in many countries. And more recently, I've been fortunate with the changes in travelability to go back to university and spend some time reading the literature and reading the project experience. So in the short time I have, I'd like to lay the basis for our discussions by presenting where things stand in terms of lessons, the gaps, and a possibility of adopting a new approach for the design of land administration reform. In 2021, last year, Credit Suisse estimated that the land and property make up 46% of global wealth, and as much as 70% 7% of national wealth. So land itself is something that is fundamental and needs to be efficiently managed sustainably so that it best serves the need of the present society as well as future society. There's increasing pressure on land due to rising population, urbanisation, climate change, concerns about food security, and competing social, environmental, cultural, economic demands for access to and use of land. Land is a fundamental asset and obviously needs to be managed efficiently. There is, I'm skipping. Land itself, or land rights, is very much is a political and policy approach, and there are lots of different approaches that could be adopted and many different contexts for land administration reform. The ability to protect and enforce property rights is a key element in new institutional economics that was developed by Douglas North and others. And I particularly like Douglas North's concept of institutions as humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic and social interaction. And these institutions consist of both informal constraints and formal rules. And that struck a chord with me as it very much aligned with the discussion in the land sector on formal and informal land markets. Governments establish land administration systems to formally acknowledge property rights and to permit property right holders to trade in those rights. Land administrations typically operate under policy, legislative and institutional frameworks that have evolved over a long period of time. Many countries provide an essential public good in formally recognising and protecting property rights. However, some governments only selectively protect some people's or some citizens' property rights, and some countries are unable to efficiently develop systems to protect and enforce property rights. There's always has been and continues to be a lot of interest in land reform or land administration reform projects. This webpage set up by the development partners sponsoring or supporting land administration and land reform lists 583 projects, past and present, and 113 active projects. So these projects cover a broad range of form, structure, and objectives, and they vary very much in context. But typically, a land administration reform project might support a range of activities that include policy and legal reform, institutional reform, capacity building, systematic registration and land titling, computerisation, valuation, and improved service delivery. Reform typically is a long-term process, and the requirements often evolve over time. Land administration reform is typically undertaken with a strong focus on economics and technical problems. The identification by government of the need for reform typically arises with the realisation there's a gap between policy and legislation and implementation. And tools such as this fishbone chart are used to explore critical gaps and the underlying causes of those gaps. Projects are typically designed by senior bureaucrats in line land agencies. The resources available to appraise projects is a bit less than it was when I started about 30 years ago. Projects designed by the funding agency often as part of a long-term program, but typically projects are limited to 5 years duration. In some countries, and the project is appraised, has to be agreed by policymakers in government and the funding agency. And in some countries, if the finance is being provided as a loan, the loan has to be approved by Parliament. There have been successes. In 1984, at the start of a planned 20-year program to register all eligible landholders in Thailand, Thailand had a title register of 4.1 million titles. In 2014, they had a title register of 31 million titles, and only 13 million of those were produced systematically. The rest were all produced sporadically under a very efficient land registration system. And in 2014, the government collected from 8.5 million transactions, nearly $3 billion US, which is 10 times the cost of running the department. Peru registered over 1.1 million informal residences throughout the country over about a 5-year period in the late 1990s. And that benefited about 5.7 million people, which at the time was about 23% of the population. So quite a significant result. Titles were actively traded and formal credit markets significantly increased. Rwanda in 2015 completed the first country in Africa to complete the systematic adjudication and registration of all properties in the country. And they did so at a cost of about $6 US per parcel. And the social economic benefits of these projects have been investigated and documented. There has been some recent reports formally looking at the sector experience, and I'm quoting 3 reports here. In 2016, the independent evaluation group of the bank looked at 14 World Bank projects that have been implemented between 1998 and 2014. In the same year, the World Bank published a report looking at 42 bank-funded projects in 24 countries in Europe and Central Asia. And in 2019, DFID published a review of major sector projects in 6 countries in Africa. I'm not going to go through these lessons and benefits, but a common theme from these lessons is that land administration reforms a long-term commitment that is context-specific. So there's no formula. The focus should be on establishing an efficient, functioning land administration system, and this requires capacity building. It's important that decisions are made on the use of appropriate technology and that there's a focus on social inclusion and public awareness. However, there are differences in some of these lessons, and I found it interesting that IEG report highlighted that there's no single institutional model for the delivery of land administration services. And this is perhaps a reaction to the best practice in the past in the design of many World Bank projects of aiming for a single agency for cadastre and registration. And the focus in Europe and Central Asia on business process, business orientation and customer focus is pretty understandable, given many of the countries implemented reform under a self-financing arrangement. But if you look at the lessons underlying, some of the problems, and there was no question there's problems in many of the countries, many of the problems are not technical and not economic. They're political, underlying causes that inhibit a project achieving its stated objectives. In Ghana, there's been 2 World Bank projects, and the reviews of that really drew out that one of the key issues hindering both projects in performing is an unresolved competition for rents by the state and customary authorities. It wasn't clear at the start who had rights to do what. Indonesia, the second project there, which was called Land Management and Policy Development Project, actually produced policy recommendations, none of which were implemented. And the agencies themselves were unwilling to share data. In Kenya, the action by veto players, both in government and outside government, to frustrate reform was highlighted. In Laos, the project was criticised for the unwillingness of policymakers to protect and improve the tenure security of the most poor, the hill tribes, and failure to foster a willingness to pay fees for registration of subsequent dealings. And Thailand, while largely successful, the politicians, despite 2 or 3 attempts, failed to legislate for improved property valuation. And I think many of them were property holders, and obviously thought the valuation system was perfectly adequate. So if you look at some of the issues that the design or the assessment and design of a reform really needs to address, some of these, is the political and legal, or are the political and legal institutions inclusive? Does the state have the authority, capacity and political will to implement the existing policy and legal framework? What do citizens expect from government in respect of land administration services? And is the agency itself focused on service delivery rather than policy implementation? And if not, what changes are needed? Perhaps business process re-engineering. There's been increasing recognition that development assistance is inescapably and inevitably highly political and always has been. I'm quoting a key reference to that from 2013. There's been a concerted effort to develop more politically informed ways of designing and implementing development assisted projects with a range of methodologies, including thinking and working politically, problem-driven iterative adaptation, doing development differently. Now, there are common elements to many of these methodologies, and there are differences. And I'm going to concentrate in this presentation just on thinking and working politically, TWP. This term was adopted in 2013, and while there's no agreed definition or framework for thinking and working politically, generally accepted there are three underlying core principles. And the first is strong political analysis, insight and understanding. Second, a detailed appreciation of and a response to local context, and flexibility, adaptability in program design and implementation. And this table here compares the traditional approach for project design with some core elements out of the TWP approach. And you can see that there's some key aspects in the thinking and working politically approach that no doubt raise fundamental concerns for development partners, including a planning paradigm where the path is undefined, the plan is for disjointed incrementalism, the theory of change is adaptive, with change agents that are coalitions and networks, and key partners who are actors pressuring government agencies for change. There is a TWP community practice, and the TWP experience is well documented. A recent review, however, found that there's certainly interesting and engaging case studies in the literature, but these do not yet constitute strong enough evidence that TWP was significantly proved aid effectiveness. So the jury's out on the process. Now, if you look at reform, many land administration reforms do require significant investment over a long period, but it's also possible to make significant change with short-term action, perhaps supported by some small investments. And I think the doing business itself has been very good at highlighting some of these short-term improvements that include things like improving the process and streamlining procedures, improving the quality of the land administration system, publishing official statistics and information, committing to specific timeframes for completion of applications, introducing online payment and decreasing the cost of transfer. And there's a range of countries quoted in the latest or the last doing business report. If you look at the literature, there's limited experience of TWP in the land sector. The one case that I did find was a project I know reasonably well in the Philippines, and the discussion about the passage of the Residential Free Pattern Act in the Philippines in 2010 as a success of the TWP approach. But really, what has been the impact of this reform? The people who formulated the TWP team that got the Act through Parliament, through Congress and bicameral meetings, listed in 2011 that there were 7.8 million residential properties in the Philippines that were untitled. And the law was passed, yet, and they made a significant improvement in the annual production of residential patents, yet only 518,219 free patents, residential free patents, have been issued in the Philippines between 2011 and February this year. And that production is very much unlikely to meet increased demand due to population growth and increasing urbanisation. So whilst TWP has been successful in getting illegal reform through, there's a clear requirement for a program to scale up the implementation of that legal reform. Perhaps one of the only land projects, or few land projects, that's been designed and implemented under a TWP approach is the Mekong Region Land Governance Program, funded by the Swiss, with Germany and Luxembourg involved. And this project is very much designed on the TWP approach, although the project actually predates the actual formulation of the TWP approach by a year. And the aim of the project was to identify reform actors in the land governance sector in Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar and Vietnam, and develop their effectiveness in lobbying governments for improved land policies to protect the property rights of smallholder farmers. And the project's preparing to go into a third phase, but grappling with continuing challenge of reporting project achievements in a system that supports projects designed and implemented in the traditional approach. So it seems clear that the land administration reform process needs some reform to better understand and consider political economy, the messy politics that's often avoided. Now, in looking at the conclusions, or looking closely at thinking and working politically, whilst the approach has a lot of potential, it seems that it may best complement rather than replace the existing processes. Changes in financing instruments, such as the payment for results recently or implemented in the last few years, still implements work or interventions through government, but provides a lot more flexibility in how those projects are implemented and what resources are used to implement the projects. The environmental and social framework also, with the World Bank, also supports opportunities to bring some of the concepts of broader consultation and political economy in the design and implementation of land projects. So the TWP process may not be the full answer, but the process could be used to explore requirements for policy and legal reform, make the necessary reforms and build and test capacity in an initial phase of a larger land project. Okay, I'm now concluded. That's the conclusion of my discussion, and I'd like to leave my esteemed colleagues with these three key questions. How does political economy impact on the provision of efficient and transparent land administration services to all citizens as a public good? What approaches can be used to capture the information necessary to understand the political economy issues in designing and implementing land administration reform? And can the process of investigating political economy be incorporated into the well-established procedures, protocols and timeframes for designing land administration reform? So I hope I haven't used too much of the time, and I look forward to the discussion with my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you for your very in-depth introduction and to TWP, but also how it's relating well to land administration design and projects over the many years. Jolene, you don't have to answer all three questions posed by Tony. There's a lot of depth to the question and your experience. So could you just perhaps take one or part of one of those questions and share your reflections on Tony's presentation?
Sure, and I just want to thank LEI for organizing this webinar, and hopefully it will catalyze interest and continuing discussion so we can figure out how to more effectively use political economy. I wanted to focus on the second question really, because when I started to reflect on this seminar kind of took a quick walk back through my 35 years of experience. I really can't find a notable success that doesn't have some element of political economy embedded in that success story, even if it's not written about in the literature. We tend to write the literature focusing on the technical best practice successes and not necessarily trying to tease out political economy success or failure. That's changing. There are some interesting papers. Tony referred to some of them. There's one on Benin that I don't agree fully with their analysis, but it is a really important reflection on some of the political economy gaps in understanding that led to problems that led to the project not getting where it wanted to get. I did look at some of the literature in the thinking and working politically community and the political economy analysis. There's like a layperson's guide to political economy analysis. I looked at a very recent paper by an author named Teskey on lessons learned in thinking and working politically. And I drew a couple of things other than just learning a lot about how they see the practice of these things. I learned two takeaways that I thought are really relevant to this question. The first one is that Teskey says since 2013, when TWP became a practice per se, it has really metamorphosed, that's what the word he uses, into other things that are called things like adaptive management. In USAID speak, it's collaboration, learning, and adaptation, and a whole different set of words that really reflect embodying in project designs and project implementation different elements of TWP. And Alan Waite, who wrote The Layperson's Guide to Political Economy that I'm referring to, basically says there's more tools than there are in a garage out there to do it. And so we tend to focus on a formal political economy analysis as such, but there are many other tools that, in fact, we are using and can be used more. Some of them are classic rapid rural appraisal or other types of rapid appraisal in urban areas, used by Roy Prosterman to inform his high-level dialogue in Vietnam to achieve a big change in the wake of war, million parcels titled, for example, to smallholders, to Hernando de Soto using that bottom-up information base and his political clout to effectively market the need for institutional reform. He also used what is now called systems mapping. I remember him showing me something he used with the government of Egypt. It's like an accordion where he laid out all the processes that it takes to get a title and get it registered, and it went around the whole room twice or something. So systems mapping is another tool in the arsenal. In our project in Colombia, USAID funded, we're using things like, and not just AID, the donor with the government, but the project implementers are required through the terms of reference to use things like key actors mapping, where we have to identify and update on a periodic basis and use in our work planning a key actors map that spells out who are the actors that have an effect on or can be affected by this project, what are their interests, what are their influences, what's their power, and how do we understand that around it. ILC has some new tools out for how to do effective multi-stakeholder dialogue, and I think in Sierra Leone's recent policy adoption, that was a pretty important application of that tool. Hopefully the World Bank's new project will then lead that to maybe an implementation success like Rwanda, we'll see. Maybe more powerfully and maybe less used, that I think could be more used, are things that are used to essentially take evidence and formulate evidence in a way that maybe other disciplines might call strategic communications. That's starting to be used around gendered norm change in the land sector, or shared value narratives. It's starting. I've seen that used sometimes going way back to El Salvador in the early 90s. Political champion who succeeded to effectively lead in big institutional reform and big practice reform was able to effectively get the classic, the notaries are in the way of reform because they have a vested interest in the status quo, and the surveyors are in the way for the same reason. They have monopolistic services. He was essentially able to convene roundtables with each of those, with small groups of leaders within those sectors, and convince them that it was better to broaden their business base and lower prices. They would end up with more revenue than if they could. So it changed their cost benefit calculation of being in favor or against reform. In some ways, that's what De Soto also did in opening up spaces for reform in other countries outside of Peru. His strategy opened the space. Others had to use other tactics and political and technical to actually drive reforms in practice. But I'm going to stop there and just say that I really think that most of the breakthrough successes that we can see, whether it's Rwanda, and Emmanuel can talk about Rwanda, there really is either a champion or some type of either long or more punctuated political economy strategy running in the background or running more explicitly. And similarly, sort of more notable failures, some of which Tony listed, or the Benin case study, have big gaps in that front. So I'll stop there and just say there are tools, and we have been using them for a long time implicitly. We're starting to see more explicit use, and we need to somehow make it gel and tease out those lessons so we can do it more effectively going forward. Sorry, I went over a little bit. Hopefully
No,
that
that's fine. Thank you, Jolene. Thanks. I think you're giving us a lot to chew on. I think Tony's going to take away a lot of this to expand even more. But Victoria, perhaps we could hear your insights.
Well, I mean, I agree completely with Jolene and Tony's presentation. And I want to go back to something that Tony said, because it really stuck with me. He said that, the problems aren't technical, they're political. Unfortunately, for someone in my position working at a, financing institution, the solutions that I have are technical. Right.
Mhm.
So it's difficult for me to go into, another country and say, well, your problems are political and this is what you should do about them. You can't really do that. And I think Emmanuel will have a very interesting perspective because he was on the other side. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. So we have technical solutions, and that's what we have to use. Now, and I also agree with Jolene very much that we do pieces of political economy analysis all the time. We do risk analysis, we do stakeholder mapping, we do institutional and legal, assessments, which are critical to understanding what are we walking into. And of course, we work with our clients who are the ones who can impact the political decision making, to support them with better information, options for solutions, et cetera, and in a perfect storm of the right things happening, you can have real progress, like we've seen in
Exactly.
Rwanda and the examples that Tony meant. I mean, my personal one is Macedonia. It's a tiny little country, only 2 million people. But, we did the reform in 5 years there, done, because the government actually integrated the reform agenda and our project into their political platform. So it was solid. Nobody was going to speak out against anything that we were doing. And that really made a huge difference. So when you have those things lining up, you can do great things. When they don't line up, of course, you can have real problems. So it's critical for us to understand those political economy issues. I think it's more difficult for us to address them in projects. I think that's what I would say. I do think that there are lots of other fora, though, for that. And so, Jolene brought up, the issue on women's land rights, which I'm going to always bring up in conversation because that's my passion. But, for instance, the Stand for Her Land campaign, it's a campaign, it's not a project, but it's all about building coalitions in countries to address political economy issues around women's land rights. That's what that's really what it's trying to do. And break down those barriers, and as well as the social norms related issues. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you. That's great. No, I think there's a lot of truths in how much you can kind of assist with all those campaigns and the advocacy going around, so that it brings this forum to line it up for the implementation. I think that's one of the takeaways that Tony was reflecting on from the Mekong Region Land Governance Project, which is happening. Emmanuel, we'd love to hear from you and your perspectives. Emmanuel,
no.
Are you able to share
Thank
with
you
us?
very much, Kate, and thank you everybody, LEI, for hosting this seminar, and congratulations.
Oh, no.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we have a bit of bandwidth issue, but I think.
Kate, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. No.
You can hear me, but his internet is really bad.
I think we might have a few.
Thank you very much. I was thanking the LEI for hosting this webinar.
Yes.
And congratulating you on the 21 years and the work you've done across the globe, particularly on the African continent. And listening to both Tony and Jolene and Victoria really makes, and I'm in agreement with most of what they are saying, which speaks to the experience that people have in these areas. Of course, I don't know if there's anybody who would dispute the importance of political economy in execution of any land program. You can talk about any factors, but political economy is very fundamental. And I also don't know any project that does not really incorporate political economy analysis or issues in some way or another. It may not be explicit, but there is no way you can even move the first step without having any political economic considerations. But again, what struck me was Victoria's statement, which is what I also had in my note, is what do you do about it? If you do this analysis of the political economy, how much are you able to engineer towards the success or the direction you want things to go? So it's very good to really understand it and maybe mitigate what you can, but those are really surface issues. The more complex, deep-rooted structural issues in society, cultural or otherwise, are not very, very easy to adjust so that you can be able to mitigate the success of your program. I also took note of what Victoria said about Macedonia, which is similar to the case in Rwanda. The RAN program in Rwanda came at the right time. Rwanda had just come out of political issues, and they had embarked on a political reform process from 1988, 98, 99. There were consultative meetings about the kind of society Rwanda was supposed to be. So through the presidency, they mobilized all sectors of society and held week-long meetings in the presidency to discuss how the Rwanda they wanted. How do we avoid the pitfalls or the problems we had experienced? So through those meetings, they were able to come up with agendas in different sectors. And this is what generated the Constitution of 2003, because they had done wide consultation across society, religious groups, civil society, military, everybody. And then they came up with a constitution. But within that, there were significant elements on land, because land was seen as a critical factor. And it was no coincidence that the year later, there was also work towards a national land policy, which drew from all these detailed societal consultations, self-introspection, reflecting on who you are as Rwandans and where you want to go. So how many countries are you going to find such a process to really cling on to and develop your land program onto? So certainly Macedonia seems to have been the case, but you not find many of these cases. Maybe the only one that I can see for many countries is the national land policy formulation process, because many countries have actually embarked on a land program before having a national land policy. That is one area that maybe countries planning a land reform can use as a way of consulting and understanding some of these political economy issues and design a program around that. Also in Tony's presentation, he did mention about piloting, which we actually found as another important avenue of picking some of these things, political economy underpinnings, that you go back and either study in detail. I mean, we would commission certain special studies on areas we identified during piloting, so that they now put back into the design process of the program so that it is adaptable to what you found through the piloting. So either there has to be an ongoing national process leading to constitution, or design a national land policy formulation process where you do consultations deeply, or accept to have a design you subject to piloting and then pick out some of these elements that we subject to detailed studies that will inform the designing of the program.
Exactly.
So otherwise, the power play in many countries, what you see on the surface is really very thin. In Rwanda, for example, you'd have maybe 3 or 4 layers of governance. You have the formal structure of government, president, minister, etc. You have the ruling party. you have the military. So all these are decision-making areas. You have central institutions, you have local institutions. Maybe before I conclude, one other point I wanted to put across, maybe for Tony. Of course, in my office as Chief Registrar of Land Titles, I used to get people bringing a lot of disputes. So one particular that struck with me was the head of the Anglican Church, one of the top leaders, came to me with an issue about a land in a village. And I asked him, reading your position, why would you be struggling with your brothers over this piece of land? And then he told me, you're young, you don't understand what you're talking about. He said, land is, he told me, I'm an archbishop, but if you go to the Bible, land is mentioned more times than faith, than love, than anything. So it has something to do with identity. It has something to do with sovereignty. So it was not something he was willing to compromise on. He even promised to bring me a book, which I haven't received, to show me why I should really take this matter more seriously. So those cultural identity, sovereignty issues are so critical that you ignore them at the peril. And therefore, I think this framework, whether in totality or mixed with what you have done previously, definitely you cannot ignore these issues if you have a special program. So I leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. What a deeply conscious response there. Thanks for all the experiences you've shared. And there's some key commonalities between some of the areas that you focused on there. And I think picking up on Jolene's comment about shared values for reform and the consultation process that you spoke about for Rwanda's reform and their vision. I think there's a lot of commonalities there that are really important. Tony, I thought maybe you've heard from 3 people. Maybe you have some ideas and some responses that you would like to share with us.
No, I think we got 3 sets of very, very good comments. And I agree with Jolene that really there's lots of tools around there that are used sometimes and could perhaps be used better or more systematically. But one of the real challenges with land is that it's very, very context specific. So there's no one outcome, there's no one process, and you've got to adapt it to the local circumstance. I liked Victoria's comment too, which is very true. You know, I'm still working on designing projects at the moment. I understand that yes, you may look at the political economy issues, and I was working 2 weeks ago in a country which I won't mention, but it's the first time I'd ever had a counterpart say to me that his problem was political economy, not that he didn't have enough instruments or enough GPS or whatever, or cause stations. His problem was political economy. Now, in his country too, I mean, the final project has got to be approved by Parliament, which basically means the project's got to cover all of the regions. It can't leave anyone out, otherwise it's not going to be approved by Parliament. But I found, that context and Victoria's comment that's what your tools are, your technical solutions and money and trying to guide them in the right direction. Fairly telling, because I didn't mention it, but the example I quoted was quoted and reviewed by the IEG report in Indonesia was the second one. And the first World Bank project largely was trying to build a first registration capacity and was meant to do 1.7 million, produced 1.9, but the main institutional reform never happened. And the second project was mainly doing the institutional reform, and that was a total failure. But there's a third project, the One Map, where they're producing 10 million titles a year. They're going to finish a task that I laid out when I first designed the first project in 1993 as a 20-year project. They're going to finish it in 5 or 10 years. Now, so what you've got in that context is the same sort of political environment is there, the same institutional environment, the veto players are still there, but you pick your opportunity. And so, you got a choice. Do you walk away or do you do something hoping it will make things better? And when you come back for the next project, you can build on a solid base. And that's definitely what's happened in Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia is probably producing more titles per year than any other country has ever done, and doing it consistently. So, and Emmanuel's comments about land policy, I mean, land policy is a different area, and as you well know, in Africa, many countries have gone down the path of having policies and then putting laws in place, or vice versa, but then had trouble getting the rubber on the road in terms of either implementing it or getting funding or getting support from communities to do things. So I agree with you that policy is a good starting point, and it's a good chance to have a discussion about some of the issues we're talking about. But it's not a panacea, unfortunately. But anyway, so quickly, that's a quick response. There's very good discussion and good comments.
Yeah. Victoria, did you want to reply to Tony's comments there, or?
I don't know if I want to reply exactly, but I mean, I was just sort of writing down like some of the things that he was saying that, I think summing up some of the sort of, okay, we're not allowed to say best practices anymore. Now we say good practices, but some of the success factors, I mean, to be opportunistic, obviously, is critical. To be realistic about what the situation is in the country in which you're working, even if sometimes the political economy of your own institution requires you to do things that you think are not realistic, quite frankly. And then, but you have to be adaptive also. And I mean, I think that there's this misconception that, you go in and you design a project and then you do it. No, of course not. It's constantly being adapted to the real situation that you're uncovering. And some of that adaptation is just happening on the fly and is an informal and some of it is very formal, and you have to restructure the project completely sometimes. Institutions change. That's the most famous example. I mean, Russia, you started out with 2 institutions, and then the top level decision maker decided, no, I just want to have one. Done. And then but the entire 2 separate projects need to be completely restructured to respond to that. And then you can do, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of parcels digitized in the course of a few years. But that it's a very specific situation. And I think the point that Emmanuel was making, and I think is critically important, whether you do it through a land policy process or you do it through a project awareness raising, you have to build a constituency that wants this reform. And if you have that from the bottom up, as well as ideally from the top down, then it works, I think.
Yeah, that's great. There's a couple of questions that have come in from our audience. So if you wouldn't mind, I'll just read one of them out.
Putting a hand up too.
Yeah, that's okay, though. I can. That's okay. I'll just really quickly, because I do think we need to leave time for that, wanted to respond to the point about laws being passed and then nothing happening. I think that's another area that if we really study it, we can see that national coalitions can form, and there can be a political moment where the incentives, the information, the political capital is there to achieve a reform, and then it doesn't stop there. It's a different calculus than of the political economy of getting it into implementation. Mozambique passed a really forward-looking land law in 1997. It was 10 years later until they even started to really pass the implementing regulations. Sometimes it's because a donor might have a condition precedent that puts pressure on certain political leaders, Ministry of Finance, to change a law. MCC conditions big dollar values on certain legal changes, right? And then after that, there has to be this intentional, maybe long arc of policy, or some of what Emmanuel and Victoria said, in place for the rest of it to happen. And it's easier where there is a moment with strong political leadership and cachet to drive that more immediately into implementation, for example, in Macedonia and at certain point in Rwanda.
Yeah. This question from the audience actually picks up a little bit in there. The question is about the fact that there are parallel political economies, like state, custom, religion in many countries. So the question is, how should a political economy approach to land reform account for all these, because it's not just obviously the statutory system in place. Who would like to attempt to answer this, or Tony, should I be putting it back to you?
Well, one of the other, but I mean, one of the things that I think you soon appreciate is you can't solve all problems in all areas. So in some ways, and just as well, you can't investigate all of the issues. I mean, every time I've ended up in a discussion with a community, you end up in a dialogue about one problem with one parcel of land in a family, and there's a whole range of issues there. Governments can't, I mean, they've got to come up with systems that solve 80% of those problems with 20% of the effort, and then look at the rest. And so some of that question, understanding all of the issues around what's happening within families, what's happening within clans or tribes, what happens with the local authorities and how they interact with the ministry, are all issues that you need to address. And then you work through, well, where's the best opportunity to make change and operate, rather than try and solve all of those problems in one go.
Yeah.
Kate, I would add that, first of all, I just really appreciate the question. I think it's one that I've been starting to think about more and more, and I think we maybe don't often enough. First of all, a well-done stakeholder analysis or systems map would discover and uncover those. It takes time, it takes intentionality to do it, but we don't pay attention as much, and we particularly don't necessarily try to understand how activity or change in one of those political economy arenas actually interacts with and changes the other. And so you can think you have buy-in and then have an unintended positive or negative consequence because you didn't contemplate how that would change power dynamics at a village level or local level. Or, I mean, this discussion about decentralizing land administration, and where is that decentralizing statutory land administration to the commune or municipality level, or is it really empowering the customary land administration? Some of the issues that are being talked about and thought through in Zambia right now, good examples of that. I don't have an answer beyond saying that's a good question, really.
It's a good question. Very good.
Yeah. Emmanuel or Victoria, did you want to comment on that question? Emmanuel.
Yeah, maybe the only comment I can make is that question is really very pertinent. I mean, those parallel structures or parallel situations are very real. And that's why I said, can even get to fully understand what you call the political economy of a country. But what I think might help is actually having strong local champions. Because clearly, if you have a local champion, there are many ways you can be able to understand these things and then have an adaptive program. Because there are certain things that are not either shared through official discourse, shared through people doing the studies, but you know them. Even amongst yourselves, you will know exactly what the situation is. But that's not something that is going to be discussed. But between people within the community, within the country, you really know what is going on. And at the end of the day, there is some agreement on what is shared and what is not shared. But if the success of the program depends on you, then you understand how to deal with these other structures that are, informal. But the definition I think Tony brought for really formal and informal institution is very, very critical. But what I feel is having a local champion, and sometimes if there's a donor who is working with them, they should be flexible, and then you have a strong partnership. I can tell you, for example, again, for the case of Rwanda, we had DFID who had very flexible approach to the program. But we personally developed very strong connection with the person who was running the program from the DFID section. So there are certain things I knew I would share with him or her, and they are willing to handle their side. And then he would also trust me to handle my side on matters that we would share. So there was mutual agreement that we really need to make this program succeed. And that kind of trust that you build between the key agents on the different participating organizations is very, very critical. So in the end, there are things we would share, and they were never in documents, but we knew we need to act on them. And I knew he would support me. I knew I would also make things work this side. So how that works, you really need to have a champion, both from the government side, but also trust from the other partners.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Emmanuel. That's
Yep.
very important. It's not something that necessarily tools can help us with. It's a lot about the inherent values and visions that you each want to try and achieve, and you kind of need to do that in specific ways, sort of really customized. Would anybody else like to make any further comments? I've got another question. We've only got a couple more minutes. I'll just ask this one very quickly. It's about the fact that politicians have a focus on the now, and donors also want to have a focus on low-hanging fruit and risk averseness in the program implementation. Do you think that the thinking and working politically approach aligns with everyone's different motivations? Yes, Victoria.
Because I was just thinking about this whole sort of temporal challenge also that you have, with land, particularly with land, because of course it is such an important national heritage, right? And so it has obviously past users, but it has current users. And then of course you have to think about the future users, right? And we tend to think about these things as infinite resources, but they aren't, as we are learning very harshly now with climate change, that these are resources that are sensitive to our using of them, and therefore we really have to be careful about how we use them. Anyway, I digress, but I think that yes, we all of us have our time requirements, right? And so thinking in a project cycle is extremely limiting, but that doesn't mean that you can't think about what happens after this project. How do we build sustainability for whatever reforms we're making into the current project, so that we know at the end of the project, maybe there will be another one, maybe there will be another donor coming in, maybe this institution and this system will be ready to run, self-financing. That's the best case scenario. But building in that thinking about how do we sustain these reforms even after a particular project ends is really critically important. And I think Rwanda had some interesting, experiences. Sorry, Emmanuel, to speak for you, but maybe you could speak about, because I think that the idea there was really, let's take advantage of the moment and get our certificates issued. But then the maintenance systems had to be built right afterwards. And that's okay. That is one way of doing it. And I think Indonesia, Tony, is another interesting example, because I think there, the One Map project is, really focusing on the mapping, right? And not necessarily on all the legal rights issues, because that's where things get complicated. But let's at least get that part done.
Correct.
Yeah. Did you want to add, Emmanuel, to that sustainability factor? Sure.
Yes, I think Victoria just got it right. You have to manage those political demands. And one of the ways is to give them some of these quick results. So like Rwanda, I think some people would think we are probably ignoring sustainability, we are ignoring informality. No, you have to deliver something for you to be allowed to handle the big picture. But otherwise, if you insist on a rigid way doing things the way you plan them, it will fail from the start. So you have to manage all these expectations. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it's time to wrap up, actually. But I thank you very much for your contributions. And I feel like it's just the start of, a conversation. 1 hour goes very, very quickly. I just open it up, though, maybe if each of you or anyone would like at least, one takeaway that you feel is, very pertinent from this conversation to take us forward and perhaps engage further down the track. Tony, I'll start with you. What would you like the audience to really take away from our discussion today?
Well, I mean, the land area is always an interesting area. We have interesting dialogues, and there's lots of different viewpoints. And so, some of the successes I was talking about, you could also read papers criticising, Rwanda, for example, for the lack of detention that Victoria is talking about and subsequent transactions. But I think the positive thing I got out of this, was a better understanding that there are ways forward. There's no magic bullet for what we're talking about. Is to try and come up with an arrangement where we can categorise things or try and prioritise areas and use that factor in the design process. Now, I don't see us doing a total TWP, but the TWP could well be something that lays the groundwork to get the law or the policy or do the pilots you're talking about, Emmanuel, which I agree with you are fundamentally important. A pilot will give you the knowledge and experience of some of the issues of how different people see the process and how they feel about the outcome. So, no, I enjoyed it. It was a very good discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Emmanuel, would you like to have a final word?
No, thank you. Just to say thank you for this session and the fellow panelists. I just wish we could have this debate more often, because I think there are many ideas that I believe Tony is going to benefit from in refining this framework, which I think we can come up with something really very practical and useful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, definitely, Emmanuel. Victoria.
Yeah, I think I want to second Emmanuel. So thank you so much.
That's it from my side. Thank you.
We need to have these conversations more often, and I'm really hoping that March of 2023, we can see some of you in Washington, D.C. for the annual World Bank Land Conference. That's my hope. And carry on this conversation in a face-to-face environment, because I think we're all missing that a lot.
Yes. That would be great. We welcome the invitation. Thanks, Victoria. Jolene, would you like to have a final comment?
Yeah, just two very quick points. One is that I was talking to some colleagues about how they see political economy, a TWP, whatever, in their work. And one of them said that thinking and working politically caused him to see that he's not just a technical actor, but that he's part of an ecosystem. And that means to me, some of the messages from today were understanding how the activities we engage in fit in that contextual ecosystem and see ourselves as a part of a process of change and not the whole change, kind of, I guess. And then kind of along that lines, understanding that technical lessons learned, while very important, are not enough. So asking what is replicable from Rwanda's experience or Macedonia and what isn't, in which context, would be a good way to maybe have better informed designs.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone. I also picked up on a few words about, intentionality in thinking and working politically, and being opportunistic where we need to, having adaptive programs and supporting local champions. So I think that's just a few takeaways as well, but I really do wish to thank you very much. I thought that we would now perhaps have a look how well our discussion is being graphically represented by our illustrator. So thank you, Tony, Jolene, Victoria, and Emmanuel, for your insights and opinions today. For our audience, we look forward to you staying connected with this subject matter that we've shared in our webinar today. We will be having ongoing discussions on an online chat that are held within the Attendee Hub forum, if you look at the community tab. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to chatting with you online. Bye-bye.
Thank you.